In the spirit of Halloween, paranormal or not, what is the scariest, creepiest or most unsettling experience of your life? I've told this before and it always gets buried. But a few years back I was in Colorado with some friends on a ski trip. Anyways, one particular night we were driving to our hotel and it was around 3 a.m. We were driving up and down these winding roads deep in the mountains which seemed like forever. It was pitch black outside and we had to at least be 45-ish minutes from the nearest town, and it was cold, like see your own breath cold. As we are driving along, my friends and I all see four figures walking on the road towards us. We all get weird feelings inside, but I did especially, and the hair on my neck stood up. Something didn't seem right. We were way too far away from a town and it was too cold for hitchhikers or hikers of any sort. We get closer and closer, and as we got right next to these people we slowed down and we realized that they literally had no faces. Four people walking in the dead of the night wearing black hoods and cape-like gowns, and they had no faces. And by no faces I mean like literally no eyes, mouth, ears, just blank faces almost white in color. I'm familiar with ski masks and these were not ski masks. They had hoods on like something from Scream almost. My friends and I all freaked the fuck out, speeding away, and my toughest friend of us all was crying. A 28-year-old man was that scared. It was the most afraid I've ever been, and it still scares me thinking about and typing out. No idea what they were or anything. Demons maybe? It will forever be a mystery. We didn't sleep well the next few nights/months. When I was a kid, I vacationed with my parents on an island in the Mediterranean. The coast of the island was beautiful, but the center was wild and mountainous, and our beach house was backed up right to the base of the mountains. Behind the house was a bamboo grove, which we were told never to play in, as it was full of snakes. The grove was the only thing separating the house from the mountains. My room was on the first floor of the house, and there were no glass windows, only screens and big rattly wooden shutters. The first night that we stayed there, all was well, and we turned in after a late dinner. Tucked into my bed, I was almost asleep, when I heard from outside a wild scream, sounding like it came from the mountains. Now, I had a very active imagination, so as you can imagine, this was more than a little unsettling. The scream came again a few minutes later, this time much closer. It sounded like a woman in incredible agony, but not quite right, not quite human. The screams began coming at closer intervals, nearer and nearer the house. I wanted to run upstairs to my parents' room, but I was paralyzed, afraid that if I left the safety of my bed, the worst would happen. At this point, the screaming was right outside my window, punctuated with clicking footsteps of at least two people, and a strange snuffling noise. At this point, there was a pause. And then whatever it was began to push against the wooden shutters of the window. I cannot tell you how terrified I was at that moment. After a few minutes of rattling, screaming, and snuffling, there was another pause, and the footsteps moved away from the house, and the screaming began to fade into the distance. I lay awake in abject terror for the rest of the night, certain that the horror would return at any moment. The next morning, my parents came downstairs and I immediately told them about the nightmarish screaming from the night before. They just laughed and told me of course it was nothing to worry about. There were wild boar in the mountains and they came down at night to eat the fruit that fell from the trees in the house's orchard. But I'll tell you what, knowing what made those sounds didn't make it any better when you hear distant screaming in the night, coming closer and closer. I don't know if I would call this story scary, but it's definitely creepy and memorable. It will probably seem made up. When I was in middle school, my best friend was a kid named James. We hung out all the time. His home life wasn't the best, so he frequently stayed at my house for a few days. We used to sneak out of my house and wander around the town, meeting up with other kids, getting into mischief, etc. One of these nights, we left my house and headed down one of the side streets. This was a quiet suburb, so there weren't any other people out. Anyway, we had gone for about 5 minutes when we came upon a house with a bunch of cats in the yard. As we got closer, we noticed that it was a very large gathering of cats, at least 20 or so, and they had arranged themselves as if they were having an assembly, sitting in rows faced towards the front door. One cat sat facing the others, almost as if he were addressing them. As we approached, every one of them turned to look at us in unison. That was enough for us, so we turned back. That was almost 20 years ago, and I'm still really curious about what was going on. Oh, and by the way, I wasn't on drugs. Recently my daughter came into my room. It was morning time, and Mom was out of town at her father's. She told me Mom was in her room at the foot of her bed last night, and that she had put a finger to her lips and said, "Shh." She was nowhere near home. She was 65 miles away. So back about 5 years ago I lost an aunt to suicide after her battling with depression and stress of bringing up an autistic child. Best kid in the world BTW. So at her removal, when they lay the body out in the casket, my granddad gets a call from his sister Breda and I could hear the whole thing. Noises as if she was in the back of an ambulance with paramedics' voices saying put him in the recovery position etc, but no sign of her voice at all. So the call suddenly ends and my granddad is beside himself with worry and tries to call back. A few minutes later Breda arrives at the removal and we rush over to her asking her about the call. She had no idea what we were talking about and told us her phone had been in her bag the whole time she was driving there. We concluded that it was just a malfunction in telephone signals or whatever. There was a log on his phone of her calling but none on hers to say she called. Weird. Here's the main thing, Breda's husband had a heart attack 2 days later. She called us from the ambulance telling us what was happening and in the background, those same voices and words saying put him in the recovery position plus the noises of obviously being in an ambulance. Weirdest and saddest week ever. Okay, so I am like maybe 16 when this happened. I encounter an interesting and cute girl on the street. We start talking for a while. We decide to meet up later at this local park. Night comes, and I start descending into this park. It's what is called a glen, basically a giant hole in the terrain that is open at one end. So I get down to the bottom of the glen, and I see a group of people. I approach them making sure that this extremely steep hill at the bottom is in between us at all times. I climb up this fucker belly pushed against the ground. I see her in the center, and then I start looking at the other people. They all look exactly the same. The same platinum blonde hair. The same sorts of clothes. At this point I should probably explain that I live in an area with a heavy neo-Nazi presence. I have always hated that part of where I live. Okay, so I am legitimately wigged out right now. I try and think back about our conversation trying to remember anything that I missed. Sadly my hormones were driving me at the time. I know they weren't going to target me as I have blonde hair, and blue eyes. My next thought was oh shit, they are going to jump me in. At that point I realized I had to get out of there. I grabbed my bag, and took off. I could hear them chasing after me. I just had to make it to the path to go up the side, and then I would be safe. Meanwhile I am dodging these stupid posts they put in the road to keep people with bikes out. In retrospect I realize why they needed to do this. At the time I am just sincerely glad that I have been riding these trails all my life. I make it about halfway up, and then I am out of breath. I go off the trail a bit, and end up in some skunk cabbage. They ride past. I finally make it out of that place. TLDR, I almost got jumped into a neo-Nazi gang, and had to bike through a dark forest at night to get away. My wife had a C-section with our daughter. For the procedure I stood near her head, holding her hand and trying to say comforting things. They put a big sheet thing from her neck down so I couldn't see what was going on. Once the baby was out they invited me over to see the kid. Seeing my baby for the first time was full of wonder and magic, but it also kind of freaked me out. Suddenly it hit me that I was responsible for this tiny, screaming little human. I took a photo of her and turned around to show it to my wife. I was now on the other side of the protective sheet so I could see them preparing to sew her up. Seeing my wife cut nearly in half with half her belly flapped open, showing me her insides was terrifying. I nearly passed out right there in the operating room.